Obsession, a powerful, sometimes irresistible urge or emotion that can manifest itself in unyielding desires and even involuntary compulsion to carry out certain activities that most rational people might deem questionable. The true problem with one's obsession, however, lies in the thoughtlessness hidden behind the blinding veil of endless desires, where gluttony, lust, and especially greed will make one neglect, forget, and even abandon the most basic of human moral obligations and responsibilities. A creature once roamed the bayous of Louisiana, its twisted anatomy seeming to bear a slight resemblance of something that might once have been human. However, the bayous of Louisiana, the very epicenter of the dreaded corruption and occult dark magic, had through sick and twisted witchcraft warped the last remnants of this person's former humanity into a dark creature of nothing but pain and relentless agony. Rumored among the hunters of Louisiana to be the very embodiment of death itself, the Grim Reaper, a twisted monster relentlessly wandering the swamps at night with the endless desire for collecting and gathering materials, always accompanied by a seemingly endless swarm of birds. Its haunting screams would warn everyone when it was on the prowl, which was more than enough to make any rational and sane person question their motivations for venturing into the dead zone. These screams, the dark silhouette, the hoarding, its close relationship with the native avian varieties, along with the stories told by the few and lucky who made it back from the encounters with it, would form the myth that would come to be known as Scrapbeak. When we take a closer look at this hideous creature, it would seem that it wasn't formed or created in similar fashion as the other dark emissaries. No. The past and creation of this horrendous creature would prove to be a tale of hopeless abandonment and unrelenting melancholy. (1863), the Civil War. The Confederate and Union States had for 2 years now fought a bloody war on the soil of Louisiana. Fighting for the Confederates, stationed in Lawson Delta, in the trenches of Fort Carmack, among the blood, bodies, and shrapnel, was a corporal by the name of Avis Windham. While defending the fort from Union forces, Avis would lose his legs to the impact of a cannonball, tearing off both limbs below the knee and damaging the rest of his body. Recovered by his fellow soldiers, Avis would survive. However, in the face of the reconstruction, he would also lose his arm, leaving him with a single functioning limb and walking on 2 prosthetics. In the following 3 decades, Avis had been discharged from his military service, broken and mangled. He had returned to his home village, where he had met a woman and formed a strange relationship. While the two didn't despise one another, it certainly wasn't a relationship of passion. They seemed almost indifferent to one another, like they both only served one and only purpose, creating a legacy that they could leave behind. And through this unspoken agreement, the two got a son out of wedlock. This child, named after his father, would grow up in a household where his only source of affection and love would be his mother. For Avis Sr., but spent most of his time either taking care of his pet birds, tending to their every need, or he would be out collecting scrap and trash from the locals, which he would tinker with at every waking hour of the day. Avis Sr. was, by all definitions, an obsessed hoarder, working as a ragman. His obsession with gathering materials, fixing the odd, the bent, and the broken, which provided as the family's only source of income, which by all definitions wasn't a lot. Avis Sr. seemed highly uninterested in his son, using his occupation to both cope and find relief from his wartime trauma by gathering discarded and broken things before putting them back together to the best of his ability. This was the only way he could preoccupy in his mind and body, both stricken with the crippling disease known as soldier's heart. To the outside of the world, Avis Sr. seemed like a great man, happy, smiling, talkative, always the center of attention whenever he made his way through the areas, looking to take both trash and other unwanted things off of people's hands. It seemed that the more broken something was, the more he liked it. The children also enjoyed looking at his various collections of gizmos, along with the cheerful singing of his birds, which he kept in a large cage in the back of his cart. The locals called him the Birdman, for wherever Avis Sr. went, his birds would always accompany him. Quite the conversationalist, Avis Sr. was always willing to listen if someone was willing to talk. On top of that, he was also revered as a hero within his local community for his participation in the war. However, this facade of smiles and cordiality only existed to obscure and hide the truth of a bitter, resentful, and angry man that harbored tremendous emotional trauma. War is a terrible thing, and Avis Sr. had lost everything. Not only had he been crippled physically from the loss of his limbs, mentally he had also been destroyed, as he had lost his profession in the military, which died together with the cause of the Confederation as the Civil War ended in defeat. Avis Sr. would have given everything for the Confederation and its cause, a cause he had believed in, a cause he had been willing to die for. Losing to the Union wasn't an easy pill to swallow, as he now remained stuck in limbo, not quite dead, but not quite alive either. The frustration of having lost his limbs, his career, and his political cause that he had pledged his very body and life to, created a man who took his anger out on the people closest to him. This made him an abusive father, a violent partner, and someone who brought the devil into the very home his son grew up in. A home that was kept a dark secret from everyone else. A home where violence, both verbal and physical, became the closest thing to affection that his son would ever get from his father. Avis Sr. cared for only two things: scrap and his birds. The birds were the dearest thing he possessed, and he would nurture them to the best of his ability, showering them with love and attention. Through his entire upbringing, Avis Jr. would again and again see himself left behind at home, as his father would go out with the birds on his cart to collect scrap from the locals. The feeling of resentment for his father's birds would over time grow almost as strong as his sense of abandonment. But on top of that, he felt the judgment of the entire neighborhood, who looked at Avis Jr. with a similar resentment of his father. How could Avis Sr., such a humble, happy, and patriotic man, have had such an ungrateful child? Always unhappy, always complaining, It seemed that no one understood the situation that Avis Jr. was living in. Finally, one day, for some strange reason, his father asked Avis Jr. if he wanted to come along for a day of collecting. Maybe he needed help. Maybe it was a vague attempt from his father to actually give him affection. Whatever it was, Avis Jr. wasn't about to turn it down. The two ventured into the swamps together, looking to collect scrap. However, his father spent so much time tending to the birds that Avis Jr.'s patience was growing thin. The air felt oddly thick, almost impossible to breathe, and the area was swarming with insects. As they showed up to collect the scrap, the people who had promised them a decent chunk of salvage had recently passed away, victims to the disease that plagued the area. Lately, the bayous had seemed to change. It had been ravaged by a terrible flu known as the yellow fever, and it looked like the disease wasn't slowing down and claiming more victims. The nights were also crowded with gunshots, and more shady people would come into town. Some of them were regular men, others scarred and mutilated. Some of them were even as pale as ash, with dead eyes and a presence that hinted at something truly horrifying hiding behind their faces. Avis Jr. thought something felt odd on the way home from the bayous. His father's continued affection towards the birds agitated him immensely, and finally, later that evening, he couldn't contain his resentment anymore. He had finally had enough. Furious by his father's affection for his birds, always nurturing them, always giving them attention, his anger reached the boiling point. All he wanted was his father's affection, to be cared for, to be respected, always hoping to catch a fleeting glimpse of the unconditional love that his father shared for those stupid birds. He had waited and waited, but no affection ever came. To his father, he was nothing more than a colleague or an apprentice. All Avis Jr. had ever wanted was for his father to remember that he had a son. Well, he had made his choice now. If he wasn't going to remember, then Avis Jr. was sure as hell going to remind him. In the dark of the following evening, Avis Jr. opened the birdcage on the back of his father's cart. One by one, he took the small birds out of their cage and broke their necks in spite. Their fragile bodies crushed so easily in the palm of his hands. Broken and twisted, Avis laid them out for his father to find in the morning. And though he was ashamed of his actions, the devastation when his father awoke to the death of his beloved birds didn't disappoint. The two got into a heated argument. At the top of his lungs, his father roared that no good man would ever kill a little bird, to which his son resentfully replied, "There are no good men in this world." With years of hate and anger behind his actions, Avis Jr. let his trembling fists rain down on his father, landing punch after punch, opening up laceration after laceration on his face, until the old man was beaten to unconsciousness, barely moving on the wooden floor. Beaten, bloodied and broken, Avis Jr. left his father on the floor, clinging to life on the verge of death. The war had cracked his father, cracks that the devil came through. His father had brought the devil into their home, into his son, into Avis Jr.'s mother. Now, Avis Jr. had brought the devil back to him. His father had always seen him as weak. That was his mistake, a mistake he wouldn't make again. And Avis Jr. left his dying father behind, with no remorse. But then, something happened. The encroaching death of Avis Sr. brought upon the attention of something else. Something horrible. For suddenly, tribes and tribes of magpies came flocking, followed by murders of crows, and even more conspiracies of ravens, all of them flocking to the swamps of Louisiana, as if they had all been summoned to this dark and forsaken place by name, rallying to the ever-growing pit of despair that was the dying soul of Avis Sr. Over the sound of flapping wings and the endless cries of avians in the sky, in his last breath of air as a human, something from the other side took hold of him, engulfed him, merged and twisted his body through dark and wicked magic, and over the screeching and squawking of the hordes of birds, his screams of agony echoed through the night, before they in a cacophony of pain and torment warped into the cries of a terror so unspeakable that most people were certain death itself had come to Louisiana. Hey there, Hazmat here. That covers the 4 current bosses for Showdown, and I hope that you've all enjoyed it. As always, a big thanks goes out to the Hunters Lounge, specifically Jim and L. Bob, Corey Peterson, Derivative, Ryan, Goose, Doug Powell, Hambone, I'm gonna butcher this, Gino Lucero, Bubonic MCCC, that's a lot of C's, Gabe Benavides, Ghosty, Jane Doe, Jose Gonzalez, Kashiyuka, Nebula, Nightingale Far, Sir Bottoms, Spooks, Stas Biestek, The Loaf of Bread, Tim Wright, Tom Hengst, and Ulf Jarlström. The Hunters Lounge does not only support me directly as a content creator, it also helps me decide on future content, and you can join it for as little as $1 a month. A big thanks to Tip and Rexley from the Hunt Showdown Discord as well, because what the hell would I do without those two? And as always, thank you all for watching. I'll see you in the next one.